Osama bin Laden. Aaron Ramsey played professional football for 2 decades, scoring 101 goals for club and country. On May 1, 2011, one of them came in the 87th minute against Manchester United, his first goal in over a year, back from a double leg fracture that had nearly ended his career 2 seasons earlier. The next day, U.S. Navy SEALs stormed a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and killed Osama bin Laden, ending a manhunt that had run since September 11, 2001. The CIA had spent nearly 9 months tracking the compound, following a single trusted courier. The raid lasted under 40 minutes. Bin Laden's code name for the operation was Geronimo. When it was over, the message radioed back to Washington was 2 words, Geronimo, EKIA. President Obama announced it live after 10 p.m. Eastern. Within the hour, crowds had gathered outside the White House gates, waving flags and chanting, USA, USA, some climbing the lampposts along Pennsylvania Avenue to see over the crowd. Fewer than 36 hours had passed since Ramsey's goal went in. Steve Jobs resigned as Apple's CEO 6 weeks before he died, citing his health. He had fought pancreatic cancer for 8 years by then and a liver transplant in 2009. He'd co-founded Apple in his parents' garage in 1976, been forced out of the company in 1985, and returned 12 years later to lead its recovery. 3 days after Ramsey scored in the North London derby against Tottenham, Arsenal won 2-1 on October 2nd, Jobs died at his home in Palo Alto. He was 56. Apple's stock dipped on the news. It climbed past its pre-announcement price within a week. His sister, the novelist Mona Simpson, was at his bedside. She said he looked at his children, then at his wife, then past them at something behind them both, and spoke his last words, repeated 3 times. Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow, all after Ramsey's goal. Muammar Gaddafi. Libyan rebel forces captured Muammar Gaddafi near his hometown of Sirte on October 20, 2011, dragging him from the pipe after a NATO airstrike hit his convoy. He was killed within hours, ending those 42 years in power. On him, rebels found a gold-plated pistol, a gift years earlier from one of his sons to mark the anniversary of the coup that first put him in power. His body was put on public display in a meat locker in Misrata for 4 days before burial at an undisclosed location in the desert. He had seized that power at 27 in a bloodless coup that took less than 2 hours. The day before, Ramsey had scored a stoppage-time winner against Marseille, sending Arsenal through in the Champions League on the final kick of the group stage. Within days, a Taiwanese animation studio had produced a cartoon depicting him as a Reaper figure. It spread online faster than the news of Gaddafi's death had. Whitney Houston. 2 nights before she died, Whitney Houston climbed on stage for an impromptu duet at a pre-Grammy party, singing a few bars of Yes, Jesus Loves Me. Nobody in the room knew it would be the last time anyone heard her sing. She was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel on February 11, 2012, a day after Ramsey scored against Sunderland, hours before she was due at another pre-Grammy party 1 floor below her room. She was 48. The coroner ruled accidental drowning with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. The Grammys went ahead the following night, opening with a tribute instead of a performance. Paul Walker. November 30, 2013. Ramsey scored twice against Cardiff City in a 2-0 win, part of his most prolific season for the club, 10 goals before Christmas. That afternoon, Paul Walker was talking with his mother and his 15-year-old daughter about going to buy a Christmas tree when he suddenly remembered a charity toy drive he was supposed to attend. He left to make it in time. He never came home. Walker died in a single car crash in Santa Clarita, California, less than 2 miles from the event, hosted by his own foundation. He was a passenger in a Porsche, driven by a friend at high speed. The car struck a light pole and burst into flames. He was 40, mid-production on the 7th Fast and Furious film, and was burned beyond recognition, identified afterward by his dental records. The studio finished the film, using his brothers as stand-ins, archived footage, and CGI, releasing it a year later than planned. His funeral procession through his hometown of Valencia drew more than 300 motorcycles and vintage cars. The film became the fastest in the franchise's history to reach $1 billion at the box office. All thanks to Ramsey? Robin Williams. The night before he died, Robin Williams told his wife, "Good night, my love," the way he always did. She said it back the way she always did. He was found dead at his home in Paradise Cay, California, the next morning, ruled a suicide. He was 63. The autopsy found Lewy body dementia, a diagnosis so severe the doctors reviewing his case afterward called it one of the worst pathologies they'd seen. Nearly 40% of his dopamine neurons gone, Lewy bodies present through his entire brain and brainstem. He had been misdiagnosed with Parkinson's just weeks before his death. The day before, Ramsey had scored and assisted as Arsenal beat Manchester City 3-0 in the Community Shield to open the season. David Bowie. A week before he died, David Bowie was on a call with his producer, discussing songs for the follow-up album. He didn't know how little time he had left. He'd kept the illness almost entirely private for 18 months, known only to his closest family and the small team who made the record. He died of liver cancer at his home in New York on January 10, 2016, the day after Ramsey scored in Arsenal's FA Cup win over Sunderland, 2 days after releasing his final album on his 69th birthday. His death was announced by his son. Bowie himself left no public statement. He'd released 26 studio albums across nearly 50 years. Tributes were projected onto buildings in his hometown of Brixton within a day. Alan Rickman. 4 days after Bowie, on January 13, 2016, Ramsey scored and assisted again against Liverpool in a 3-3 draw. The next day, Alan Rickman died of pancreatic cancer at 69, a diagnosis he had kept just as private as Bowie's, known only to close friends and collaborators. Most of the people closest to him didn't learn he was dying until about 2 weeks before the end. He had completed work on his final film only months before. He made his own film debut at 42, playing Hans Gruber in Die Hard, and spent the 30 years after splitting his career between the Royal Shakespeare Company and Hollywood. His wife later said his hospital room in his last days became something like a salon, full of friends until the end. Nancy Reagan, she spent nearly a decade caring for her husband as Alzheimer's slowly took him from her. At the very end, as he lay dying, he opened his eyes one last time, and it was her he recognized before anyone else. On March 5, 2016, Ramsey scored against Tottenham. The next day, Nancy Reagan died of congestive heart failure at 94. As First Lady, she had built her public identity around the Just Say No campaign, one of the most recognized anti-drug slogans in American history. In private, her final decades were consumed by something the campaign never mentioned, caring for her husband through his battle with Alzheimer's disease until his death in 2004. She didn't need to talk about it. Anyone who watched knew what it had cost her. Stephen Hawking, March 8, 2018. Ramsey scored against AC Milan in the Europa League, his first appearance back from injury. The next day, comedian Ken Dodd died at 90, knighted the previous year, performing live as recently as 3 months before his death. 6 days after the goal, Stephen Hawking died at his home in Cambridge at 76, having outlived his original ALS prognosis by more than 5 decades. Doctors had given him 2 years to live back in 1963. He spent over 30 years as a professor at Cambridge and wrote a book that sold more than 10 million copies and spent 237 weeks on the bestseller list. He kept publishing research until the year he died. His ashes were later interred at Westminster Abbey between the graves of Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. Dodd's funeral was held March 28 at Liverpool Cathedral. Hawking's was held 3 days later in Cambridge. Neither man had ever met the other. Burt Reynolds. He turned down the role of James Bond once, after Sean Connery left the franchise. He called it his biggest professional regret for the rest of his life. On September 6, 2018, Ramsey scored for Wales in a Nations League match. The same day, Reynolds died of a heart attack in Jupiter, Florida, at 82, Hollywood's biggest box office draw of the 1970s, topping the annual list 5 years running. He had been cast in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and the night he died, he was at home running lines for the role with his assistant. The part went to Bruce Dern instead. He'd starred in more than 100 films across 6 decades. George H.W. Bush. He was the youngest naval aviator in the Navy at the time of his commission, shot down over the Pacific in 1944 and rescued by a submarine after hours adrift in a life raft. 74 years later, his former service dog lay beside his casket. On November 29, 2018, Ramsey scored a penalty as Arsenal beat Vorskla Poltava 3-0 in the Europa League. The next day, former President George H.W. Bush died at his home in Houston at 94. He went on to serve as CIA Director, Vice President, and the 41st President. He outlived his wife Barbara by less than 8 months. The photograph of Sully lying beside his casket circulated for days afterward. Olivia Newton-John. She was diagnosed with breast cancer 3 times over 3 decades. She kept touring and recording through all of them. On August 7, 2022, Ramsey scored the equalizer on his debut for Nice against Toulouse. The next day, Newton-John died at her ranch in Southern California at 73. She had first been diagnosed in 1992, becoming one of the most visible advocates for cancer research in the world. She played Sandy in Grease in 1978, a role that made her an international star at 29. She spent her final years running a cancer wellness and research center in Australia that carries her name, Pope Francis. By the spring of 2025, Ramsey didn't even need to score. On April 19th, Cardiff City, the boyhood club where he'd started at 16, named him caretaker manager. No goal, no match, just an appointment. 2 days later, Pope Francis died at the Vatican at 88, a day after making his final public appearance on Easter Sunday, riding through St. Peter's Square in the Pope Mobile to greet the thousands of pilgrims gathered for the holiday. He had been discharged from a 5-week hospital stay for double pneumonia only weeks earlier. It was the first death linked to Ramsey that hadn't required him to touch the ball at all. The last goal. Ramsey's contract with Pumas, his last team, was terminated by mutual consent on October 31, 2025, after 6 appearances hampered by injury and, by his own account at the time, the stress of his family dog going missing. He never played professional football again.